I'm Pastor Theron. Welcome to church where you are in your Wednesday Bible study. Thanks for joining me. Before we get started, I'd like to say a special word of thanks and greeting to the good people of Bellevue Baptist Church in Westlake, Louisiana, who are using these videos to help their congregation who are not currently meeting due to the ongoing corona pandemic. If you or your church or your group would like to use these videos as well, please contact me. You can reach me on Facebook Messenger or you can call me directly. Our passage this evening comes from John chapter 21. It's a great story. It's one of my favorites, and it goes like this. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And it happened this way, that Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. And Peter said, "I'm going out to fish." And they said, "Well, we'll go with you." And so they went out and they got into a boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. And he called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." And Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore, and it was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." And none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Take a moment and think to yourself about the definition of miserable. What to you is miserable? Have you ever been in just absolute misery? I grew up in Idaho, between Montana and Washington, and grew up in something of a subsistence lifestyle. We always had a big garden. We burned wood for heat in the winter, and we ate wild game that we hunted for during the fall. I can remember many times as a young person going out hunting with my parents in October, November time frame, and it was cold. And we would go out, we would get up long before daybreak, try to have some breakfast, and then we would sit in the truck and wait for daylight to break. And as it did, my dad and I would start down whatever hill we were going to go down that day, and my mother would take the truck and go down to the bottom and wait for us. And we would spend the majority of the day fighting the brush and fighting the terrain. We started early. We often ended late. Man, it was a great way to grow up, but it came with certain challenges. You know, I can remember sitting in the truck just waiting, just shivering, just waiting for the sun to come up, wishing we could get out and get started so I could start warming up. But then as we would fight through the brush and the trees and up and over the terrain and the rocks and whatnot, I would get wet from the dew, or maybe it was raining or even snow. And you know, all that hiking and climbing and fighting the brush that we did was exhausting. And we'd get down to the bottom of the hill, and very, very often we'd come back to the trailer empty-handed. We would stay in a camp trailer out in the woods, no electricity, no running water. Oh man. And we'd come back in just wet and cold and hungry and tired and empty-handed. And that for a long time for me was the definition of misery. Well, here we find the disciples in a very similar situation. They've been out on the boat all night. They've been out fishing all night and have caught nothing. This is the time frame. It's post-resurrection, but before the days of Pentecost. And so the disciples are just waiting for whatever it is that Jesus told them to wait for. They're not really sure. There's a lot of confusion. They don't know what's going on. And Peter seems to be restless here. Peter is a man of action. And I get the impression that he just needed to do something productive. A lot of people have criticized Peter for deciding to go fishing, thinking maybe that he was returning to his old way of life. You might remember the story from early in the gospel. He is one of the very first disciples Jesus called. In fact, Peter is from the area that this story takes place, in the Sea of Galilee, up in the north country of Israel, in a town of Capernaum is where he lived. And he would have been very familiar with this water. He would have fished it many times. And he just decides that he's going to go out and go fishing. And he says, I'm going to go out and fish. And some of the disciples went with him. And there's a list of their names. It was Thomas, called Didymus. And oddly enough, Didymus means twin. So Thomas had a twin somewhere in there. Nathaniel, who was from Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee. That's James and John. And then two others. And they were all together, and Peter decides he's going to go and fish. And they said, well, we'll go with you. And they got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Now, fishing is very commonly done on the Sea of Galilee at night. During the day, it gets so hot, the fish go down deeper where the water is cooler, and then at night they come back towards the surface, and they feed on insects and smaller fish and this type of thing. And that's when fishermen will go out into the water, and they'll use their big nets and scoop up the fish. And the water of the Sea of Galilee is just full of fish, and many, many different kinds of fish. The problem is that these nets that they were using are fibrous, usually plant matter. They require constant tending, and they're fragile. So they're out this night, and they're out fishing, and I can't even imagine what that night was like, but they worked all night, and early in the next morning, they have caught nothing. Now, they follow what I'm saying here. They're miserable in a unique and personal sort of way. Their leader of their group has been killed. He's been resurrected, and they've seen him, but they don't see him every day and every moment. He kind of comes and goes. There's this ongoing frustration of, what do we do next? Jesus told us to wait, but what are we waiting for? We don't know really what's going to happen next. There's the ongoing frustration of, what are we supposed to be doing? And Peter says, I'm going to go fish. So they get into the boat, and this particular night, I'm imagining it would have been springtime, because that's when Easter is. That's when the resurrection would have taken place. So it's very cool overnight. So they would have been up all night, so they're tired. They've been working all night, so they're physically tired. It's cold, so now they're tired and cold. They probably haven't had anything to eat, so they're hungry. And now they're empty-handed. So they're tired, they're cold, they're hungry, they're empty-handed. Now suddenly a new dimension is added to the story. In verse 5, there's a person on the shore who is calling out to them. He calls out to them. They don't know who it is initially. And he calls out to them, "Hey, friends, haven't you any fish?" Well, that just adds insult to injury, doesn't it? You're tired, you're cold, you're hungry, you're empty-handed. Now all of a sudden there's somebody heckling you from the shore that says, "Hey, friends, haven't you any fish?" But it's really interesting, because the word friends here in verse 5 it translated from the Greek is not really friends. It means something more like little children. It's almost a heckling kind of greeting. It'd be like, "Hey, little ones. Hey, kids. Haven't you caught anything?" Oh my, that would have been just almost too much. I can imagine as they respond. Their response is simply just no. I imagine them on the boat, just miserable from the night's work and empty-handed. You got this heckler on the shore calling out, "Hey, little ones. Hey, guys. Don't you have any fish?" And they don't even bother to turn around. They just look over their shoulder and, "No." Then all of a sudden, this person on the shore that they can't quite see. You see, I get the impression as the story unfolds, the sun hasn't quite come up yet. It's still mostly dark. There would have been probably a fog or something on the water. It's hazy, I imagine. And this person, this heckler from the shore says, "Well, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." Now, how did he know that there were fish there? Peter's been fishing these waters for years. He knows these waters better than anybody. But still, this person on the shore seems to think that they know that there are fish on the right side of the boat. Now, when they lowered down the net, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large catch of fish. And it turns out that there were 153 fish. As the story begins to unfold, I can imagine that they're amazed by this catch of fish, and they're starting to look around, and they're starting to begin to wonder, who is this person? And John is the first person to notice that this heckler on the beach is not just some stranger that sees them out fishing. No, this is a post-resurrection manifestation of none other than Jesus himself. I can imagine as he leans over the side of the boat and begins to peer through the darkness and through the fog, he says to himself, "That's Jesus." Now, this is an example of a miracle that Jesus performs over nature. There are three different kinds of miracles that Jesus performs: those that for healing, those that bring people back to life, and miracles over nature. This is one that is a miracle over nature. How is it possible that Jesus knew that there were fish on the right side of the boat? Well, he is Jesus. God made flesh to dwell among us. Did he see them from the shore, or did he appoint them to be on the side of the boat? Either way, it's a miracle. But that's not the greatest miracle that takes place in this story. As John is leaning over the side of the boat, and he begins to understand and recognize that this shadowy character on the beach is Jesus, I wonder, did he whisper it, or did he shout it? Did he lean over the side of the boat and say, "That's the Lord"? Or did he lean over the side of the boat and peer into the darkness and say, "It's Jesus! It's Jesus!" Either way, the reaction of Peter leaves little doubt. He jumps into the water. The text says in verse 7, then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around himself, because he'd taken it off. He's been working, so he took off his outer garment. You're not going to go and meet somebody formally just in your loincloth or your underpants. You're going to put your outer garment back on. So he wraps it around himself. He had taken it off because he'd been working, and he jumped into the water. Now, again, in the Greek, this is interesting because it doesn't just say that he jumped into the water. What it says is that he threw himself into the water. He hurled himself off the boat into the water. Peter had some unfinished business to do with Jesus. He wasn't going to let that rest. So as the other disciples are following along in the boat and towing the net full of fish, it says in verse 8. They were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have caught." Now, all of these fish are collected into a fragile net that was always in need of tending and repair. That could be considered the second miracle. The first miracle being knowing where the fish were to be found. The second miracle being that the net itself didn't break. But either of those are still lesser miracles to the real miracle that takes place later in the chapter. When they landed, they saw a fire burning of coals with some fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you have caught." And Simon Peter climbed aboard, and he dragged the net to shore, and it was full of large fish, 153. I don't know that there's any symbolic meaning to the number 153. Some have argued that the number represents the number of people in the thousands or tens of thousands or millions or something that would be converted before Jesus returned. Some would say that's how many countries existed in the time of Jesus, and so it represented that people from every country would be converted. I don't know that there's any argument to be made of the symbology of the number, except that somebody counted. And what that means to me is it adds credibility to the story, that somebody took down note of the small details of this story as it unfolded. And it says, "But even with so many, the net was not torn." That's quite significant. Jesus then said to them, "Come and have breakfast." And none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. I've asked myself, and I've asked many people through the years, would you have to ask? If you were invited to a seaside breakfast with Jesus as the host, would you have to ask, or would you just know? If Jesus was to speak to you, would you recognize his voice? Do you know when that still small voice speaks to your heart, speaks to your soul, speaks to your spirit, informing you, instructing you, convicting you, calling you? Do you recognize the call of Jesus? Do you recognize his voice? Do you recognize being in the presence of Jesus? What an invitation to join Jesus for a breakfast. Now, this breakfast is symbolic in a sense that it mirrors the Last Supper that they had just weeks before, where he invited them to eat together. Here, though, instead of a nighttime meal, we have a morning meal. And the Gospel of John is full of the symbology of darkness becoming light. And that plays into this story too, because it's early in the morning, after they've worked all night, after they've struggled all night, after they've been miserable all night. Suddenly a new day is dawning, and a new day for service to the Lord. So within the list of miracles, there is the miracle over nature, knowing where the fish were. There is the great catch of fish and the net not tearing. But further down in the story is the greatest miracle of all, and that is the miracle of redemption. That as Peter hurls himself into the sea and swims to shore, he is greeted by Jesus. And Jesus restores Peter. Peter had denied him 3 times just days before. As Jesus was being led off to be tried and ultimately convicted and crucified, people would say to him, "You were with him." And he would say, "No, I wasn't." "Hey, you're a follower of Jesus." And he would say, "No, I'm not." And "Oh, you're a disciple of his." And he called down curses on himself, and he said, I do not know the man." And then the rooster crowed those 3 times. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the rooster crows, you would deny me 3 times. Well, here Jesus restores Peter in like manner. He asks him 3 times, "Peter, do you love me? Do you truly love me more than these?" He says, "Yes, Lord, You know I love you. And Jesus said, then feed my lambs. And again he says, do you truly love me? And he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. A third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know. The greatest miracle of all is the redemption that Jesus offers to the repentant. That Peter would seek that restoration, and we can as well. By confessing our sin, by receiving the Spirit, by asking the Lord to forgive us, we can be the recipient of that redemptive nature of Jesus and have our soul and our spirit restored as it should be, that we might be in the presence of God. Thanks for watching.